It's a natural progression in sports. A competitor will come in, find success for a few years, and eventually fade away. It's less common, though, for this to happen to an event. In auto racing, that event might be the Pocono IndyCar race.
It's coming. The Schaefer 500 at Pocono.
Known for speed, diversity, and danger. A true driver's trap.
The third and final leg of the Triple Crown of auto racing. Pocono, Pennsylvania.
The back there, there were 10 wide.
How was that? 7-8?
The Pocono 500 is an event that was once prestigious but lost its luster. Much like the Southern 500 in NASCAR, the Pocono 500 was a crown jewel race whose reverence diminished. It was once the second biggest race on the IndyCar schedule, one of the largest sporting events on the East Coast, and Pennsylvania was crazy for IndyCar racing. But while the Southern 500 made a return to glory, it's unclear if Pocono ever will. Ironically, even at its height in the 1970s, the relationship between IndyCar management and Pocono was tricky. Bizarre moments in its history include trying to run the race days after a major hurricane, 2 high-profile lawsuits, and financial losses. To understand what happened to this once great race, we need to go back to the beginning. When track construction began in July 1965, the Pocono Mountains were one of the hottest vacation spots on the East Coast. Data also said that behind Indiana, Pennsylvania had the highest number of spectators at the Indy 500. The tourists and racing crowd made it the perfect place to build a superspeedway. Construction was led by a group of businessmen headed by Dr. Joseph Mattioli, a Philadelphia dentist who had built resorts in the area. A 3/4-mile infield oval track was the first to be finished in 1968. Its inaugural race in October of that year was rained out. Located in the clouds 2,000 feet above sea level, rain would be a recurring problem for the mountaintop track. The first race on the infield oval was rescheduled for May 1969, a 100-mile super-modified race unfortunately marred by tragedy. Troy Ruttman was a former Indy 500 champion who made his final start at Indy in 1964. The car he drove then was turned into a super-modified, driven at Pocono by Troy Ruttman Jr. The 18-year-old was in his first race when he suffered a stuck throttle on lap 65. After hitting the turn 3 wall and knocking Ruttman unconscious, the car continued at full throttle onto the front stretch, where it went through a guardrail and landed upside down at the base of the grandstands. Ruttman died instantly in front of a small crowd of 3,000 people. The race was stopped after the crash. In mid-February 1970, it was announced that USAC would hold an IndyCar race on the superspeedway in July 1971. Pocono also paid $50,000 for a guarantee it would be the only 500-mile IndyCar race in a 13-state East Coast area. In addition, a 500-mile USAC stock car race would be held in September 1971. As the race drew closer, Pocono was immediately treated as one of the sport's premier races. It was part of IndyCar's new Triple Crown of 500-mile races, joining the Indy 500 and the Ontario 500. It quickly got the nickname Indy of the East. Because of its expected size as an event, the state of Pennsylvania loved it as well. State officials salivated at the thought of drawing people from around the country to the Quaker state. With 40 million people within a 4-hour driving area, it was estimated the Pocono 500 could easily become the 4th largest sporting event in the country. Ahead of the race, the first driver to make a lap at the track was Mike Mosley in April 1971 as part of a Firestone tire test. Ironically, Mosley was seriously injured in the Indy 500 and would miss the first Pocono 500. The track also signed a contract with Schaefer Beer to sponsor the event, making it the first 500-mile race to have a corporate sponsor.
Schaefer is the one beer to have when you're having
47 cars were entered when practice began on June 19th. For the next 7 days, teams got 9 hours of practice each day. When including a final practice before the race, teams got 67 hours of practice in total. It was expected that over 100,000 people would attend the race, but the track had only a few two-lane roads leading to it, and fears of major traffic jams scared away thousands. A slightly disappointing crowd of only 75,000 people saw 33 cars lined up on race morning. Joining the race from Indianapolis, Tony Holman gave the command to start engines, and Tom Carnegie was track announcer. Both men resumed those roles for several years.
Start your engine!
The pace laps are underway for this inaugural Schaefer 500 at Pocono. Sam Hanks driving the pace car, leading the first row. Mark Donahue of Media, Pennsylvania, Bobby Unser of Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Al Unser of Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so after about 15 years of dreaming of this Pocono International Speedway, the green flag is ready for the inaugural event. The pace car moves off the track into the pit area. The cars are coming down to the starting line. And the green flag is out and the race is on.
Appropriately enough, the race itself was dominated by Pennsylvania natives. Mark Donahue and the Roger Penske-owned car started from the pole and won the race by a little over a second. It was the first IndyCar win for both men. Penske would eventually win the race 11 times. IndyCar returned for the second race in mid-June 1972. This event would be the first major challenge to the relationship between track and series. Practice began on Tuesday, June 20th, amid a threatening backdrop. Later that night, Pennsylvania was devastated by Hurricane Agnes. In several days of constant rainfall, part of the state had 19 inches of rain, and some river levels rose over 30 feet. At a cemetery 25 miles from the track, over 2,000 caskets were washed out of the ground, and bodies were found on local roofs and in basements. Over 50 people were killed, and the state suffered over $2 billion in damages. The storm was the worst disaster to ever hit Pennsylvania, but USAC insisted that the race continue 1 week later. Pocono had roughly 7 inches of rain, and after the hurricane delay, practice resumed the following Tuesday. The next day, USAC and Joseph Mattioli had a lengthy meeting to decide whether the race would continue as scheduled. Expecting nearly 100,000 spectators once more, the governor of Pennsylvania advised the track to cancel the race. Local roads were still washed out, and firemen and laborers were busy in other parts of the state. USAC offered to bring the necessary people in from Indianapolis. While the track urged postponement, USAC threatened to take all the cash Pocono posed in prize money and never return to the track again. The stage was set for a climactic battle at 8 a.m. on Thursday morning. When practice was set to begin, teams pushed their cars out of the garages and were stunned with what they found. Locked gates and armed security guards blocking access to the racing surface. Mattioli held the keys, and there was no way around it. The race would be postponed no matter what USAC said. Reaction to the dramatic events was mixed, and there was doubt IndyCar would ever return. An outraged Gary Bettenhausen was quoted as saying, "The grass should grow very tall before we race at Pocono again." On the other hand, his car owner Roger Penske was on USAC's board of directors and in support of the track. He threatened to pull his teams out of IndyCar racing if the track wasn't treated fairly, saying, quote, "If USAC doesn't re-sanction this race for this year, I'll resign as Eastern Vice President. Not only that, I'll consider withdrawing my cars from championship competition, and maybe I'll start my own sanctioning organization." Amid these threats, USAC agreed to reschedule the race on Saturday, July 29th, 1 day before a previously scheduled stock car race. The IndyCar stock car doubleheader was successful, but confusing. Late in the race, a scoreboard error placed Al Unser in the lead instead of actual leader Joe Leonard. Both men pulled into victory lane while the race was reviewed for an hour. Leonard was given the victory. The following day, Roger McCluskey beat Richard Petty, Al Unser, and Dave Marcus to win the stock car race. For 73, IndyCar returned, and Pennsylvania embraced the event even more. The Pocono 500 Festival was a week-long celebration of the race, including a parade in Philadelphia. When the race came, the infield was packed with rowdy partying. After the build-up, A.J. Foyt won in a thrilling finish, when leader Roger McCluskey ran out of fuel on the final lap. Al Unser suffered a minor concussion in a lap 11 crash, and the race was red flagged for 45 minutes to repair the boilerplate wall. In 1974, Johnny Rutherford won Indianapolis and Pocono in the same year. Also that year, NASCAR's Winston Cup Series came to the track for the first time. One of the biggest problems facing the Pocono 500 was the weather. Almost every year after the hurricane race had rain, most had at least some practice washed out. The 75 race was shortened when a storm hit with 30 laps to go. After a week of rain leading up to the 76 race, the starting lineup was set by a random draw. Despite its problems, the race continued to be prestigious for IndyCar through the late 1970s. Crowds had nearly doubled since 1971 to the point where 120,000 spectators showed up on race day. By the end of the decade, it was the second highest paying race on the schedule, behind only Indianapolis. And drivers viewed the track as safer than Indy, mainly because the speeds were slower. The worst injury came in 1977 when Mike Mosley suffered a concussion in a crash, sidelining him for 2 months. In 1978, Al Unser was the first to claim the Triple Crown when he won at Indianapolis, Pocono, and then at Ontario. He drove the entire Pocono race without changing tires. But if rainy days were the biggest problem for the track, a larger storm on the horizon would permanently damage the race in 1979. At the end of 1978, IndyCar racing was split between the two series of USAC and CART, as discussed in another video on this channel. Pocono stayed on the USAC schedule, while most of the major figures in IndyCar went to CART. Making matters worse, CART banned their teams from competing in USAC races. While Pocono had traditionally been a race for 33 cars, it only attracted 25 entries in 1979. It was a weak field of aging drivers and teams that failed to qualify at Indianapolis. Denny Ongais was the only kart driver who raced at Pocono, and he was fined $5,000 for defying the ban. Ongais and A.J. Foyt were the only two prominent drivers to compete, and attendance was terrible. The race itself was bizarre, delayed 40 minutes when dozens of spectators walked onto the track during the pace laps.
But several dozen spectators have gone through the fence from the infield and the retaining barrier and have been standing in the exit area of turn number 1 at trackside each time the fields take a parade lap. Now, whether that's going to have an effect on the start, I can't tell you. They're still sort of meandering back to where they're supposed to be as the infield crews are trying very hard to get them back there to safety behind the barriers.
A caution came out again on lap 167 when more people walked onto the track during green flag racing.
Eli Gold had it down in turn 1, Varney. A couple of people, apparently, if you can believe this, ran across the racetrack while the track was under green flag racing. So USAC observers quickly notified the tower and the starter stand, and Dwayne Sweeney has put out the yellow flag once again.
A.J. Foyt won by 2 laps. In 1978, the race attendance was about 110,000. In 1979, it was roughly 40,000. Losing nearly 70,000 customers in 1 year destroyed Pocono. Because the race lost so much money, the track nearly went into foreclosure. To save the track, Indianapolis Motor Speedway actually stepped in and agreed to lease Pocono in 1980 and promote its races. The deal allowed track management to retain ownership and pay off its debts. At the same time, NASCAR races at the track were very competitive. A good rules package meant cars could draft and slingshot. For several years, the NASCAR race at Pocono had more lead changes than Daytona. While the best IndyCar drivers stayed away in '79, the NASCAR race saw 56 lead changes. Local spectators soon shifted away from IndyCar and were hooked on NASCAR. In late 1979, Pocono management filed a lawsuit against CART, seeking $6 million in damages as a result of the ban. When USAC and CART briefly merged in 1980, Pocono was again on the schedule while the lawsuit was ongoing. The two series split for good shortly after the race. For 1981, Pocono joined Indianapolis as the only 2 USAC IndyCar races held that year. Once again, CART banned their drivers from racing. And once again, Pocono was devastated. There were so few entries that sprint cars were added to the field as fillers. After a rain-shortened race, Joseph Mattioli again sued CART for banning their drivers from racing at the track. Claiming this violated antitrust laws, the track wanted $9 million in damages. Pocono was left off the IndyCar schedule in 1982 while the lawsuit was ongoing. Without going to trial, a settlement was reached in early May of '82. The track was allegedly given a large confidential settlement, and Pocono was a very late addition to the CART schedule. A race was scheduled for August 3 months later. An agreement was also made that CART would lease the track and promote the IndyCar races at Pocono for the next 5 years instead of letting the track handle it. In the first race of the CART era, Rick Mears won easily in front of a decent crowd of around 60,000 people. Johnny Rutherford suffered a broken right hand when he crashed hard in turn 1.
And Rutherford loses it! Rutherford up against the wall! An awesome crash here in the first turn! Rutherford continues to slide. The car disintegrates under an impact with that boilerplate wall.
Through the mid-'80s, the Triple Crown was again a major part of IndyCar's annual appeal. With a 500-mile race now in Michigan, a driver would win $1 million if they could win all 3. Unfortunately for Pocono in the 80s, crowds never returned to their level in the 70s. Lower estimates claimed that 35,000 people attended each IndyCar race, while 70,000 fans came to the NASCAR events. When CART's 5-year contract expired at the end of 1986, the future of the Pocono 500 was in doubt. The track was unhappy with how CART was promoting the race and felt they could sell more tickets if they were in control. Hoping to get back to 70s success, the track signed a 3-year contract to remain on the schedule. Beginning in '87, Pocono would regain promotion of the race instead of CART, but the track found out they couldn't do much better. Over the next 3 years, attendance barely reached 50,000 people. The track lost money every year. Making matters worse, drivers were very vocal in their complaints about the bumpy surface and aging boilerplate metal walls. After 1988, Quaker State left the race as title sponsor. Mattioli said it was because of all the driver complaints. Oddly enough, the track still called the race the Quaker State 500 in 1989, despite not getting any money from the oil company. The company issued a statement saying they no longer had a relationship with the track, and Pocono claimed the name was in reference to Pennsylvania's name as the Quaker State.
Bodine has already lost it here at this point and impacts hard with that boilerplate that surrounds this racetrack. It's one of few that has that ring around it. The outside wall is actually iron, and there you see it. And that impact has, in fact, it appears, put a hole in the wall at turn 1.
And there's a car in trouble. There's car number 80, Jimmy Horton, really has hit the wall hard.
His confrontation with the wall has knocked a hole in the boilerplate, and it could be that we will have to, there's the hole, could be that we're going to have to be cautioned here for quite a while they replace this barrier. Now,
as he went into turn 1, he was on the outside. Looks like Lake Speed might have lost an engine, or at least he lost the car, and Greg hit him, and they both head to that wall. Greg Sachs hit it hard with the right front, and then the car gets upset and starts rolling over
in turn number 1, and again we're going to be delayed considerably because the wall has given away once again.
Wow. Now it's pretty thick and it's pretty solid. So imagine, if you will, hurtling down at about 175 miles an hour and blowing a hole through almost a half-inch thick piece of boilerplate. These guys are really wrecking their race cars.
Entering the 1989 race, Mario Andretti said the drivers wouldn't return to Pocono in 1990 if the track wasn't repaved and concrete walls were added. While Mario maintained that Pocono was his favorite superspeedway to race at, the track needed to be updated. The driver threats didn't matter. 3 days after the 1989 race, Joseph Mattioli informed CART that they no longer wanted to run an IndyCar race. Mattioli claimed the track was losing up to $300,000 with each event. He believed the crowd was permanently alienated by the '79 split, didn't like IndyCar's increased focus on road course races, and instead latched onto the NASCAR race. He was quoted as saying, "Our fans don't like races that are run on road courses and in parking lots." Despite its problems, CART and its drivers were disappointed to lose Pocono in 1989. The prestige that came with the 500-mile superspeedway race couldn't be replaced anywhere else. The Triple Crown, a major storyline for the last 2 decades, was dead. For the next 20 years, Pocono's NASCAR events grew. In the early 2000s, they attracted over 100,000 spectators, reaching the levels of the IndyCar races in the 70s. In January 2012, Joseph Mattioli died at the age of 86. Under new leadership and a different racing landscape, Pocono wanted IndyCar back.
In 1971, my grandfather and my grandmother brought IndyCar here with the help of the Holman family and Tony Holman and all the great folks out in Indianapolis. And today, it's with great pleasure and tremendous honor that we officially welcome back the Izod IndyCar Series to Pocono Raceway and the Tricky Triangle. As we always say in Pocono, we do have the best fans in all of motorsports, without a doubt. And they made it perfectly loud and clear this year that they wanted IndyCar back here. We're truly honored to help them out and give the fans what they want.
Not only that, the Triple Crown was back as well. If a driver could win at Indy, Pocono, and Fontana, California, they would win $1 million.
And we are in the rolling hills of northeast Pennsylvania in Long Pond for race number 11 of the 2013 IndyCar season. Welcome to the IndyCar Series at Pocono.
In 2013, IndyCar returned on its traditional 4th of July weekend to respectable crowds of around 30,000 people. The first few years of the return were clean and fast races. In 2014, the average speed was 202 miles an hour and set the record for the fastest 500-mile event in auto racing history. But as early as that year, the event's future was again in jeopardy. A major drop in ticket sales after 1 year was called scary by the track president. In an attempt to get more spectators, the event was moved from July to August. The change seemed to help. With a competitive rules package, the race in 2015 broke a record for lead changes. The tragic accident of Justin Wilson, however, overshadowed an exciting race. But increased ticket sales and improved racing convinced IndyCar and Pocono to stay together.
Rahal going for the lead. Hunter-Reay trying to come with him. And Kanaan trying to come back. Better. I'm not sure how you can race much better than this as Graham Rahal goes back to the front around Tony Kanaan. Now here's Kanaan again to the front. And here's Graham Rahal popping down to the bottom once again.
This is every lap. These guys have been passing each other for the lead.
The race in 2017 shattered the record for lead changes with 42, but things started to unravel in 2018. A new body kit for Indy cars made passing harder. Perhaps it was because of this difficulty that drivers were extra aggressive. A crash before the green flag was embarrassing. Robert Wickens' crash on the first green flag lap was horrifying.
Oh! That's Robert Wickens! And his teammate is into him as well, James Hinchcliffe.
The track was heavily criticized for its fence repair. After the bad start, the race was clean and went caution-free for the remaining 475 miles, but it also had 31 fewer lead changes than the year before.
I have to say, despite a 2-hour red flag period or just thereunder, these fans, a lot of IndyCar fans in the Pennsylvania area, and they've been loyal. They've hung out. They've hung in there.
Returning in 2019, it seemed likely this would be the final IndyCar race at the track. Another first-lap crash didn't help the track's image, as dangerous in the minds of some, whether that's deserved or not.
Did it? A lot of cars. Up in the fences, Rosenquist.
Continuing a bad tradition, the race was shortened by rain, but the event had several positives. The attendance continued on a steadily increasing trend. Estimates said around 30,000 fans were in the stands, roughly the same as the return in 2013. The race was also IndyCar's most watched race on a cable network since 2017. Drivers voiced their opinions on whether the event should stay. The feedback was seemingly split by experience level, with series champions like Scott Dixon, Will Power, and Simon Pagenaud strongly in support of the track.
I will completely understand if IndyCar takes Pocono off their schedule, but with more people in the stands and higher TV ratings this past weekend, I'll also understand if they keep it on the schedule. I don't envy their position, but will respect them either way.
Expectedly, Pocono did not return to the IndyCar schedule for 2020. Both the series and track at least publicly said they wanted to return, and the decision to split seemed financial. The Pocono IndyCar race is an unusual story. It's an event rich in history that seemingly wasn't appreciated. It's hard to state how big the Indy of the East was before politics hurt its image. It seemed there was always fighting surrounding the race. Track versus series, drivers versus track, track versus Mother Nature. In its return in later years, more problems continued. It was an event hurt recently by rule changes that reduced passing and forced drivers to act more aggressive. Adding to that, the shortened schedule caused people to say drivers weren't prepared entering the race. In 1971, teams got 67 hours of practice. In 2019, 2. Once again, Pocono's departure left a void in IndyCar. It leaves Indianapolis as the only big oval and the only 500-mile race. 2020 will be the first season since 1914 that IndyCar will have no races in northeastern states. It's especially ironic considering that IndyCar continues to be dominated by people from Pennsylvania. Andretti, Ganassi, and Penske are all from the Quaker state. What used to be so significant is gone. Maybe Pocono could have been IndyCar's throwback race. Maybe it would be the perfect track for an IndyCar NASCAR doubleheader. Or maybe the race is gone forever.